So recently, Facebook announced that they're going to be launching their own cryptocurrency, Libra. And I think what that means for the greater industry is that this could be something that ultimately drives sort of adoption of the technology. And I mean, the regulators are having a hard time with it, and people have all sorts of mixed feelings about this. But the reality is, like, nobody can ignore that this is here to stay now.
That was Kelley Weaver, the CEO of Melrose Public Relations, which is a PR agency that focuses exclusively on blockchain and cryptocurrency technologies. Today's episode is fascinating, and it's part 2 in our cryptocurrency series. Kelley goes into some of the most interesting use cases for blockchain technology that she's seen and where she thinks it's headed in the future based on the knowledge that she's gathered through her career working with a variety of companies in various areas of blockchain. So I hope you'll stay tuned and listen for a very exciting episode. I'm excited to share it with you. But remember, listen carefully, think critically, and conclude thoughtfully, whether it's in this podcast or anything else that you've come across in your daily life. For that, I'm Luke Scorziell, and you are listening to Bills. Hello, and welcome back to Bills with Luke Scorziell. Today, we are joined by Kelley Weaver, who is the CEO of Melrose Public Relations and the host of the Crypto Token Talk podcast. Kelley, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Luke.
So another interview on cryptocurrency and blockchain. So I hope the audience is enjoying it, but I'm really looking forward to it because there are a lot of, I guess, what is called use cases for these different technologies, and many of which hopefully we'll get into today. But before we get into all of it, I'd kind of just like to break down what exactly you do as a public relations firm for cryptocurrencies and blockchain.
Sure. So I should mention I'm a USC alum, so fight on.
Fight on.
Love that you're getting your start in Annenberg. It's awesome. So I started my company about 7.5 years ago as just a traditional lifestyle PR firm based here in LA, and worked with restaurants, and my background was more in lifestyle communications. And so I was like kind of scared to take on tech clients, but with the advent of like the Snapchats of the world coming to our backyard here in, quote unquote, Silicon Beach, sort of couldn't ignore the tech revolution that was happening at our doorstep. And so an advisor had encouraged me to look at working with these tech companies. And so that was how that came to be. And I was introduced to a company called Gem that's based in Venice, California, that at the time was working on enterprise blockchain solutions. So that's how we discovered blockchain. And so originally, based on the fact that we're rooted as like a lifestyle and consumer focused PR firm, that's one of the reasons I was sort of wary to take on tech clients, because I thought I'm not technical at all. But interestingly enough, a lot of what we do as like PR and marketing for blockchain companies is, for lack of a better term, like dumbing down the messaging so that regular people can understand it, because a lot of decision makers in companies are like business minded, and we need to appeal to the business minded folks, not just like the super techies that understand like the deep technical aspects of these solutions. And so we're really tasked with building brand awareness for these companies that are doing really cool, potentially world-changing things with this technology. And we're, sort of tasked with getting the message out there to, multiple different audience verticals. There's different types of audiences that they're looking to reach, but we're really trying to, get their messaging out there in a clear and concise way. And so that can be in a variety of ways, like getting them on podcasts like this, getting articles placed in more mainstream news sites like Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and Reuters. And then, working with a lot of crypto and blockchain specific focused verticals. There's a lot of podcasts and influencers that we work with that are in this space, that we work with over and over again. And then we also help our clients with building thought leadership and expertise in their given subject matter, because most of our clients, all of them are rooted in blockchain in some capacity, but they're always blockchain meets something else, like blockchain meets ad tech, like, ad tech solutions for blockchain, or meets healthcare, or like better payment solutions. So inherently there's usually two or more verticals that we're dealing with. And so, we're helping build thought leadership in those areas by helping them draft, like we ghostwrite bylines and op-eds and things that showcase their thought leadership on the given topic. But it spans lots of different areas, even helping them like get placements on panels at events and things like that. So we're basically helping them build their brand awareness and exposure in the media.
Definitely, and I think that all sounds really interesting. And I want to pick up on one of the things you said at the very beginning of breaking it down and kind of dumbing it down for the average person, because that's kind of, I think, what partially my goal is even understanding it myself, is like, what is all this technology? Because you can kind of tell it's going to be involved in the future in some way, shape, or form. But another thing is just that like it seems like you're working more on the blockchain side of things than anything else. So how can you kind of explain that technology to us, and then how it works into those different fields that you were mentioning, like healthcare and even several others outside of just the crypto space?
For sure. I mean, I think the best way to explain it is to explain it as it relates to the use cases, because the technology itself is like pretty unsexy. Like inherently, it's basically just like glorified, accounting or record keeping, like a giant spreadsheet of transactions that people can't mess around with. Once a transaction's there, it's not going anywhere. So, healthcare was sort of the example that got me suckered in the beginning and really helped me understand, wow, there's really a place for this. Because if you think about your own health records, for example, like, anytime you've gone to the doctor and, all your medical records are like extremely hard to access. If you wanted to find out how many immunizations you've had over the course of your lifetime, for example, it may be difficult to come across that information, and it's not in one place. And, even though that like is inherently your right to have access to that data, it's very difficult to get. Ultimately, I think that it's easy for people to appreciate that there's a real problem here, and this could be solved with basically great record keeping and permissioned access. So, where you could give, like, let's say you landed yourself in the emergency room and you had to give temporary permission, like, maybe 24-hour access to your medical records, that could be done, instantly. And there's a number of different ways that could be done. But, you would inherently have access to your medical data and be able to share that with whoever needed to see it. And another health care use case is like, as it relates to revenue cycle management, if you think about billing when you go to the hospital, you typically get a paper bill, and sometimes even after you've paid that bill, you still get paper in the mail. And so if there was some sort of instant settlement when you're checking out, where your bank could speak to your doctor, could speak to your insurance company, and all settle on a instant basis, then there wouldn't be all of this, paper trail that's just wasting billions and billions of dollars and time. The technology itself is going to solve for problems like these in the future. And that's where it becomes really interesting for people, because they see, the problems that exist today. And like, you don't really need to understand the full scope of what the technology does to appreciate like the problems and the potential solutions.
And one question that just kind of comes up for me and listening to all of that is, like, how does blockchain and all of this differentiate from the internet and the technologies that we have right now that kind of seem to keep us wired and connected in the same way? Is it more secure, or what's so unique about it?
Yeah, great question. So really the inherent difference is the concept of decentralization. And all that means is that, right now your medical records, for example, are like stored at UCLA's, medical center, or like on their, closed circuit network that only, they can see and isn't shared with anyone. The difference with blockchain, and the beauty of the Bitcoin network that was like the first example of blockchain, is that basically this ledger, like think of it like a Google spreadsheet or a Google Sheet doc, is shared amongst a number of different computers. And so when a transaction happens, it's recorded in that sheet, and it's shared amongst, hundreds of thousands of computers across the globe. And so every time there's a new entry, those computers are tasked with verifying, okay, this happened on this date. We're going to, verify this and move on to the next line item. And so, people can't maliciously go back and change that, because one of the 100,000 other computers would see that, hey, what do you mean? Like, Luke didn't go to the doctor. Like we saw it and we verified it, and we're already on the next line item. So it's the concept that this data is shared, and it's sort of cryptographically encrypted, I suppose you could say, so that like if you needed to see the actual details of the transaction, like the sensitive information like social security numbers or anything like that, you wouldn't see that, but you'd be able to see that, okay, this happened at this date and there's no going back and changing that. And so that's what it means by decentralized, because it's not owned by any one computer or system. It's sort of shared amongst this giant network of computers across the world that's all verifying this information happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's actually one of the better ways I've heard it explained. And then coming back around kind of is, so that's the underlying technology. And then you specifically in your firm, you're working with the companies that are utilizing that technology to create different use cases?
Exactly. And oftentimes we're telling the stories about those use cases and what's being done. I mean, like payments is a great use case. Like originally Bitcoin was built for, like peer-to-peer payments. If I wanted to send you $10, for example, we can do that with Venmo, but then there's like inherent, and Venmo is great today, but like I have heard of, just problems with like accounts being levied and, funds being frozen. Like PayPal is a great example of this. PayPal is a great way to transmit money, but like oftentimes businesses have their accounts frozen for different reasons, and it's incredibly difficult to carry on business when your account's been frozen. And oftentimes those are not, like, it's just red flags that trigger those like funds to be frozen, and then it's just like a giant long process to get them unfrozen, and in the meantime you're still trying to conduct business. And so there are difficulties, and there are reasons for that, and there's a lot of good reasons why those safeguards are in place. But I think originally Bitcoin was attractive to those that really had pain points with traditional systems and access to being able to do that, to like, what if one day PayPal just said, okay, everybody's out of money, like what could you do, And so it was attractive to like those people who were looking for another way. But today, like payment solutions like can be done using blockchain technology, but like to give you an example of where we're at today, it's really difficult to make it happen at the speed with which it needs to happen. Like, Visa and MasterCard process like tens of, or probably hundreds of thousands of transactions a second, and it's super fast. Blockchain's not there yet. So we can't, unfortunately, like we have a client right now who's working on a payment solution, and it's just not there yet because of the inherent network of having all these computers having to verify these transactions. Like the speed's not there yet. As it relates to the tech, there's a long way to go.
Here's Misha Yurchenko, who was on our episode last week in the first episode of the cryptocurrency series on the same topic, that it's not quite blockchain or Bitcoin's time. Here you go.
You can't expect the world to change overnight when a new technology comes out. So rather than thinking in 1 to 2 year timeframes, think in 5 to 10 to 20 year timeframes.
But once we're there and there's like a demand and a need for it, like this is going to be a way better way to transit money between each other. And, there's people working on those types of solutions. And
I mean, just talking about healthcare and how it could impact that would have huge impacts on the current system of healthcare and insurance and how hospitals work and all of that, because I think that's one of the most frustrating experiences that a lot of people have these days, and they're kind of looking towards government to solve, but maybe the solution will come from somewhere else. And one other kind of question I have just on your clients is, what is one, or maybe there are 1,000, but what's kind of one notable client that you've worked with that their idea just kind of like hit you and you just couldn't really stop thinking about?
I mean, so the first company we worked with was this company, Gem, that I mentioned earlier, that was working at the time on enterprise blockchain solutions for the healthcare verticals. And so we were working with Capital One on this revenue cycle management use case about like kind of the settlement that we talked about before, how like insurance could, verify instantly with like and settle with your bank and, the doctor's office. And understanding why Capital One was looking into this and understanding like just the problems at scale and how much money could be saved, like was just a real eye opener. And then also access to medical records. At the time I was bi-coastal and traveling back and forth between North Carolina and Los Angeles, and like, I'm a healthy person, but like we're still using fax machines to share like medical records. And that to me was just like it was just obvious why like there's got to be a better way, you know? So that was sort of the one that sucked me in. And now we work with all different types of solutions for like, as it relates to like digital ad fraud and creators and ways that they can monetize their content directly. And we work with like a stable coin project that's, looking to solve for like a cryptocurrency that doesn't have like the extreme volatility that we have today. We work with like a sustainable mining project that's building out like this infrastructure in the Mojave Desert. That's super cool, like for, tackling sustainability, because mining, which is a whole nother topic, is very energy intensive. So there's just all sorts of really cool use cases. I mean, I think one thing that could be interesting to note is that recently Facebook announced that they're going to be launching their own cryptocurrency, Libra, and the stakeholders who are involved, they're building like a organization to help make this happen. All the stakeholders were announced, and they were like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard. And I think what that means for the greater industry is that nobody's doubting that blockchain technology, like there is a place for it, and that there's use cases for cryptocurrency. The Libra Foundation is looking to tackle especially like the unbanked and bringing them access to be able to, transmit value. And I think the fact that, Facebook has billions of users and that there's, billions of unbanked, this could be something that ultimately, drives sort of adoption of the technology. And I mean, the regulators are having a hard time with it, and people have all sorts of mixed feelings about this. But the reality is, like, nobody can ignore that this is here to stay now, and that there's definitely use cases here that are really, really interesting. I mean, I think the unbanked is an interesting use case as well. We worked with a company called Right Mesh that was helping build mesh networks, which is like basically the ability to share your bandwidth or your connectivity. And the UN declared that connectivity is a basic human right. And I mean, more people have smartphones than have bank accounts now. Like, thinking about third world countries and not problems that we deal with, on a day-to-day basis, but how these applications could help and serve people who don't have, like basic human rights access to information, for example, is really interesting.
Just kind of picking up in there, I mean, all of the things that you just mentioned are, I think, immense positives of that technology. There are, I guess, a lot of things on the flip side that, I mean, even just how Bitcoin originated on the dark web as being kind of this anonymous way of doing business. So I'm kind of interested to see how you, as a PR professional, I guess, think about those differences and that kind of contrast between like an immense positive for the technology and then this kind of dark side of the technology, and how you make sure that when your clients are announcing their new projects or their ideas, it is sure to stay on this kind of positive side.
Totally. It's interesting you bring that up, because when we first started working in blockchain, it was early 2016, and like at that time Bitcoin was like really a dirty word. Like Gem, for example, the company we were working with, didn't want to mention Bitcoin because it was so associated with Silk Road and the dark web. So it's interesting how like the hype cycle and the sort of the awareness cycle around cryptocurrencies has gone like up and down, even over the past 3.5 years that we've been working on it. I think when you talk about the potential positives to do with the technology, like there's no doubt that there's going to be, malicious uses of any technology, I think. And sometimes like that's going to help drive sort of more mass adoption, unfortunately. But I think it's a matter of staying, on top of like what positives this could bring to the world, as opposed to talking about all of the potential negatives. One of the things, I mean, that we sort of lived through over the past 3.5 years was the rise and fall. I don't know if you heard about the sort of ICO bubble and craze that happened. ICO stands for initial coin offering. And basically teams were creating their own, cryptocurrency use cases, and then raising, basically crowdfunding, selling their own tokens to fund their projects and ideas. And these weren't registered securities with the SEC. It was basically just like a glorified crowd sale. And there was a lot of really interesting projects that launched and like are still building and are doing great things. Like RightMesh was one that I just mentioned. That's a great example of a project that's really, fighting the good fight. But at the same time, there weren't the checks and balances in place from a regulatory standpoint to be able to like stop this. And there was no certainty that came out of, the SEC or other regulatory bodies to say like, these are securities, you can't issue them without, registering like you would any other securities. There was a lot of money being raised and quickly, and there was this rush happening of like, we got to get our project up and we got to make it happen quickly before regulation catches up. And there was a lot of like get rich quick types. And so, I mean, it was very interesting as a service provider. Like here we were, this small LA based, blockchain specific firm that had some experience in this vertical. And seemingly overnight, all of a sudden, everybody across the world is trying to launch, their own cryptocurrency or ICO project, some with good intentions and some with the intention to sort of get rich quick. And so we had just a tremendous amount of inbound interest because we were like one of 3 marketing and PR agencies that specialize this, not just in LA, not just in the US, but in the world. And that had done anything to do with this, because at the time when we saw it as like a potential to specialize was, when there was like maybe 10, I mean, maybe 20 reporters across the board in mainstream media that like had ever even touched this topic. There really wasn't that much media. So we saw an opportunity to like really root ourselves in and maintain great relationships with reporters who were talking about it. And then, all of a sudden it became very, very interesting to a lot of people. And so unfortunately with that came like, some projects that were out there for the wrong reasons. And so what that did, and very quickly this like came to light. What happened to like the reporter community that we, became really tight with is just like a gigantic amount of skepticism because they had to cover their own butts. Like they couldn't be reporting on projects without doing some tremendous due diligence because, what if they, favorably report on a project that, it turns out a few months later was really, like the company just dissipated because there was no checks and balances in place to like stop anybody from doing that. And when companies make millions of dollars in like overnight, what's the incentive then to work on it? They've made all this money, like, what's stopping them from just going and buying a Lamborghini and like calling it a day? Yeah. There's really not much except for, positive PR drives, like, more liquidity for the token eventually. And so people want to buy it more. But my point is, not only are we up against the skepticism of the media as it relates to like cryptocurrencies being used for nefarious activities, but also like just the whole like kind of eye roll as it relates to like, oh, there's all these teams that are just doing this for the wrong reasons. And I don't know, like, what if they don't deliver on their project? Or even like the more gray area was like these teams that actually did plan to build this stuff, but, didn't necessarily have the business expertise to be able, they were very technical and super smart, but hadn't built businesses before. And so you're, again, given millions of dollars overnight, but they don't really know how to then, use that wisely to like really build a sustainable business and, didn't necessarily like, it wasn't a get rich quick intention, but like couldn't deliver on the promise because it like proved more difficult than they thought once they got into it. And so, it's been an uphill battle as it relates to new projects that we take on. Really we're doing a lot of due diligence ourselves about the projects that we're aligning ourselves with because they really have to have, impressive backgrounds as a team on their own and sort of a demonstrated ability to be able to deliver on these promises or a working prototype or project or product already, because it's difficult to build trust within the media without that. So we've had to sort of like overcome that. And a lot of what we're doing is building expertise and thought leadership, like a good digital footprint. So we'll help our clients to write content that sort of demonstrates their own expertise and builds, trust. And that way, when reporters have seen like over and over that they've, the way that they think about different topics and the way that they, are thoughtful about building teams and things like that, they're gonna like feel better about reporting on the companies because, there's other things to show for it.
And that is looking through your website a little bit, that is one of the main functions that you do, right? Is I guess shaping up these clients and then giving their packages or whatever's going on to the media and then allowing them to kind of publicize that way. So what like processes you're talking about, like vetting the different companies and making sure that they're not just trying to make a lot of money and then ditch the whole project. So how do you kind of go in and vet them to make sure that everything is what it seems to be and that it's not a kind of get rich quick scheme or something that you don't really want to work with?
So it was a lot more difficult when we were getting, the volume of inbound that we were getting in, like mid to late 2017 was just, I think we were getting outreach from like over 100 projects a week. It was crazy. And we actually had someone who was sort of his main job was to perform due diligence, and his background was in like venture capital. And so it wasn't dissimilar from, the way that you would vet a company that you were going to invest in potentially, like looking at, potential market size of the business, looking at the team and their credibility. And we had a very formal process for like looking at these things. Now I will say the industry's cooled off a lot, and because there's not the amount of money being raised, although I just heard that this company raised $60 million in like 15 minutes yesterday. So it's, it's still happening, but not to tune that it was. Like, I think, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but like, the billions and billions of dollars were raised in ICOs in early 2018 and 2019. It's been like in the hundreds of millions. So it's like, money still being raised, but not a lot less. So
just jumping in here to give some context and numbers, because numbers are actually available on this topic. In 2017 and most of the way through 2018 until about October, over $20 billion was raised in ICOs. That's an incredible amount of money that went to a variety of companies, some of whom were legit and others were scammy and taking people's money. Now, that number, as Kelley said in the interview, has significantly decreased. In the first quarter of 2019, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, only $118 million was raised. That's down 58 times what was raised in the same quarter in 2018. For more comparison, that's $118 million in the first quarter of 2019 versus $6.9 billion in the first quarter of 2018. So a huge difference, and something that really makes this conversation very interesting, and a future conversation with Mark Boron on the same topic of how exactly money is going to be raised by companies who want to do legit Bitcoin things, since people are much more wary. But anyways, you'll have to stay tuned for that. Now it's time to go back to the conversation.
A lot less. So the projects that are coming through, it's actually a breath of fresh air for us because it's a lot more thoughtful. They're not expecting to raise all this money overnight anymore because there isn't really that money floating around. It's a lot more difficult to raise capital, especially because, the overall sentiment of like Bitcoin and blockchain is, it's starting to like be favorable again, but it has really, people are, even like venture capital in Silicon Valley is just like less excited about blockchain than it was 18 months ago. So it's a lot more difficult to raise funds. So I think the people who are still attracted to building projects in this space are really like the true builders. And so a lot of what's coming across my desk is a lot more inherently legitimate than it once was. I think one of the best examples that we got from like the craziness and the heyday of like ICO fever was like someone wanted to do an ICO to raise money for a worm farm. I was like, how does blockchain technology apply to like worm farms? It's just like so ridiculous, but like anything, and then like add the word blockchain and like all of a sudden they think they have just a winning idea. And so that, those days are over, thank goodness.
Well, and just kind of carrying off that and going into like if you're saying Silicon Valley is not really interested in this anymore, and there's just a few companies that are really like diligent about the work that they're doing, do you think that's that kind of lack of interest from Silicon Valley that seems to be this like pioneer of, I don't know, new technology and whatever?
There isn't a lack of interest. It's just not what it was. For a little while there, it was like, this technology is going to change the world, and like I need to find a way to, get in on the next hot blockchain project, and there isn't just that appetite anymore way that it once was. But capital flowing in to the ecosystem for sure, just not to the tune that it was.
Yeah.
And not from the consumer side as much. It's much more thoughtful people that know what they're doing, and which is a good thing.
Well, do you think like people kind of have this perception that Silicon Valley has to be behind like each drive of new technology, but do you think it's necessary? I mean, they still have interest, obviously, and there's a lot of money up there. So regardless of what, I guess there's still a lot pouring in, but does there need to be this like huge drive for it? Or is it just kind of, because what I was thinking and kind of where
Great
I was
question.
stalling out was that what we were talking about, the technology still being kind of slow for the blockchain ledger updating. So, but once that's like kind of improved, then all of a sudden there's this room for a lot more innovation in the area.
For sure. I mean, I think the answer to your question is I don't know, like if there needs to be, but I do think that the Silicon Valley types, the investor types that have like hit, big again and again, probably know what they're talking about, but I will say that things like, for example, the example that I gave earlier, like Facebook announcing the launch of their own cryptocurrency, although it's met with some skepticism and like, differences of opinion and regulation, is like, wait, what are you doing? This is an overall positive because I think it instills confidence in those investor types that like, this isn't going anywhere, and we need to be, figuring out how this is going to affect, traditional industries and systems, because, it's kind of like unavoidable at this point. And then the other net positive that something like Facebook has launching this is, regulation has got to catch up now. Like there's no, they're like, wait, what? Time out. What are you guys doing? What do you mean you're announcing this? Like, we need to be able to, look at this first. But the net positive for the overall industry is like regulation has, like, they can't just turn a blind eye anymore. They've got to like figure out, okay, how to regulate this and what it means, which is a net positive for everybody. No matter how they decide to look at it, they'll at least have, there will be more sort of certainty around it for everybody else. And one of the reasons I think that the money dried up a little bit was there was so much uncertainty about regulation, and people were scared. Like they didn't want to invest in it because they didn't want to invest in unregistered securities and like how that might affect them personally. Companies obviously don't want to be like, investigated by the SEC and like committing any fraud or like, potentially going to jail. I mean, there's just a lot of risk. And so the more certainty there is around about how this is going to be regulated is like ultimately good for everybody. I mean, because ultimately, I think most of the companies that were raising funds were not doing this to, avoid, taxes or anything bad. They just, saw an opportunity and wanted to capitalize on it. And, but the more certainty we have around like what you can and can't do, the better.
So what do you think are the certain areas that need this government regulation? I mean, I just look at, like we had an interview with George Saramalis of Overlooked, and one of the things he told me that I thought was kind of funny, he runs a website that has an algorithm that checks fake news, and he said that his team, which is like 15 college students operating in a basement at USC developing this algorithm, should have been the one questioning Mark Zuckerberg instead of Congress, because you look at Congress and they have no clue at all really what they're talking about. Smart people obviously to get elected in there, but as far as the internet goes and new technologies, it's questionable at best of whether they will be able to develop effective regulation. But what do you think are the certain areas that need to be looked at for this regulation, or will it just work itself out?
One for sure is like, I think that the taxation around this needs to be looked at, because, one of the things that's cumbersome about using cryptocurrencies in general right now, like, Bitcoin and using it as mechanism of payment. It's taxed like property as it is right now, and that's really, really difficult for, like, if you're going to buy a coffee using Bitcoin, for example, like the way you're supposed to do it is calculate your cost basis on that. And, it's just not, if that's how they're going to tax these currencies, like, it's never going to be effective for day to day. And so I think that's one area that needs to be looked at and needs more clarity around that, because right now people are just doing the best they can. I think a lot of people are not using crypto to avoid taxes at all. They want to pay their taxes, but it's just really, really difficult. We as a company accepted payments and made payments using cryptocurrency for a couple of years. And I've really like kind of pumped the brakes on that a little bit, only because it's so tricky come tax time at the end of the year. Like, that needs to catch up. And I think regulation needs to take a hard look at what that means. So that's one area that I would like to see more clarity. And then as it relates to, like, fundraising and these, token sale models and things like that, I do think that there needs to be more, there is a lot of, I will say they are doing the best that they can. The SEC is really on top of it now, in terms of really taking a look at this and educating themselves. And there's a body called Coin Center based out of DC that's like a nonprofit that's really helping to, and they're almost in every single like hearing or anything that around this, as kind of like the translators from the technology to the regulators. And so, they're a nonprofit. I think they're doing a phenomenal job. And the more and more that we see of entities like that, like helping, from the lawyers and from the actual entrepreneurs, talking to the regulators about what they want and what they need and explaining it to them in a way that they can understand, is going to help tremendously. And I think, unfortunately, right now, or at least from what I've seen, there's a lot of fear around that. Like, companies don't want to call the SEC and be like, hey, does this look like a security to you? Because they don't, they have an agenda, and they also don't want to like bring attention to it if they're doing something wrong. And there's just this overall sense of fear. I think if there's more collaboration, it's going to lead to a lot more, positives and at least clarity around how this stuff is going to be regulated. Because from my opinion, it seems slightly unclear, and everything's been a little different. And then, post ICO boom, there's been a lot of investigation into companies, and people have had to correct their wrongs, which is a good thing. But again, there wasn't much certainty around it. So everyone's just, at least as it relates to our clients and colleagues, like, everyone's doing the best they can to work within the lines, but like, it is kind of slowing things down in terms of, I suppose, innovation. And even like Facebook's organization, Calibra, the Libra Association, my understanding is it's like an entity that was formed in Switzerland because, it's just like easier to do this stuff abroad than it is in the US. And so the US like is inherently maybe hurting themselves a little bit by not, hurrying up and getting on it.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, it's just so complicated and how it would even begin to be regulated, because like, we're just getting around to good or bad talking about regulations for the internet, and the internet has been around for not like a terribly long time, but significantly longer than these new technologies that we're talking about today. So it is something that, how does government possibly get in there and do that? But another area, and then I guess kind of coming down to the end, but that I kind of want to get on, is that this could be used by government in certain areas. So there was one area in particular of voting that blockchain could be kind of used for. So could you go into that and what you see blockchain doing for that area?
Yeah, I think, inherently, because of the way that blockchain is sort of a decentralized ledger of transactions, and it's like tamper-proof, and people can't go back and make changes, and the sort of permanence of it makes a lot of sense for things like voting, because you've seen a lot of corruption in voting and question about like tallying and things like that. And when there's sort of a indisputable digital ledger of transactions, it's really hard to argue with the validity of what you're seeing. And so, voting makes for a great use case for this technology. And we worked with a company in the past who was working on block-based voting. And there's been a lot of different companies working to solve for this, but I think it's a great use case, just because of the properties that blockchain, solves for, and, the problems that we've seen in voting in the past.
And I mean, one of the things that a lot of people talk about is voting by your phone and being able to vote remotely as opposed to actually having to go into a polling place. So is that something that blockchain would allow us to do securely? Because some of the questions that arise are, well, could your vote be compromised? What could happen after you put in that vote from your mobile device when it actually gets into the system? So would blockchain, do you think, allow for voting to be achieved remotely?
For sure. Absolutely. Eventually. I mean, I think, again, like things need to be solved for in terms of like speed of transactions and things like that before we see this at scale. But, we're already seeing like voting as it relates to like internal voting within enterprises being used on utilizing blockchain technology, and it's working great. So, it's not at scale yet, but, I think that eventually this technology will lead to being able to do things like that mobile, and it having sort of instilling confidence in the consumer or the voters that that there isn't any tampering. And, but unfortunately we are a little ways out. I think one of the misconceptions that I even had personally when I first got like kind of hooked on, wow, this technology is like really like cool and is going to change the world. And I really felt like, and I, unfortunately I haven't worked in tech in the past much at all. So I really didn't know that this stuff does take time. And, unfortunately, like a lot of the time these promises are, it seems like we're only a couple of years away from this, but, it does take longer than you might think. And I really think, I mean, I don't know the timeline, but, I'm thinking now it's more like 5 to 10 years at least before we see this stuff, being used on a day-to-day basis. There aren't that many. I mean, there's a handful of use cases that are really cool that you can use today, like blockchain-based browsers you can use, and consumer rewards networks and things like plugins on your current browser. But there aren't that many up and running live blockchain-based applications at scale that like consumers can use right now. And we're still a few years away from that.
Yeah. And I mean, we'll have to have another conversation in 10 years when it's all coming down to the wire. But I think this technology just has such great potential, and I truly am excited to see it. I think everyone should be really excited to see where it could lead. And hopefully this was a bit of a preview for that. Where can our listeners find out a little bit more about you and then listen to your podcast?
Sure. So I'm at Crypto Kelley on Twitter. I'm Kelley Weaver on LinkedIn, both good places to reach me. And the podcast you can find at cryptotokentalk.io, or it's just Crypto Token Talk on Twitter. So yeah, thank you so much. And I think one of the best ways to understand or to get hooked on this technology and dive in a little deeper is to have a little bit of a vested interest in it. And so one thing I encourage people to do is buy $5 worth of Bitcoin on Coinbase, and just or up to $100 or something that you don't mind losing, and you'll see the price move, and it'll be a reminder of why you need to learn a little bit more. And so, I mean, when people join our company, that's one of the first things we do is give them $100 worth of Bitcoin or Ethereum. And it's just it gives people a reason to care about the technology. And so I encourage everyone to, potentially download the Coinbase app and buy $5 worth of Bitcoin. You don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin for it to matter. But that will give you a reason to care about this. And, it's kind of a fun way to start your journey down, learning more about it.
Yeah. And it's funny because the last interview we did on this, Misha Yurchenko kind of gave the same recommendation to just buy enough that you don't mind losing, follow the technology for a little while, and then see where it ends up.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Again, that was Kelley Weaver, the CEO of Melrose Public Relations and the host of the Crypto Token podcast. So go check out both of those if you want to learn more, and be sure to tune in to the last episode with Misha Yurchenko on blockchain and why he's bullish on investing it. And tune into next week's episode with Mark Boron on the regulation side of cryptocurrency, blockchain, and that technology. It will be very interesting. And with that, I am going back to school in just a couple weeks here, where I will be a producer on our Annenberg Media radio station on Thursdays. So if you want to tune in to our show called From Where We Are, then you can do that, and I will be producing that, maybe have some clips. Hopefully, we'll be updating the podcast somewhat regularly, but school is important and it's busy, and I have a lot going on. But you can still follow my progress and what I'm doing over on annenbergmedia.com and here. So with that, be sure to tune in next week. Go over to theedgeofideas.com/subscribe, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And I will see you next time. I'm Luke Scorziell, and you are listening to Bills.